Come on. The more times you state a problem in a different way, the more likely it is that your perspective will change and deepen. So, I'm Mel Larsen. I help cultural organisations to find, understand and reach new audiences. I deliver that through consulting, training, coaching and mentoring. So I spend a lot of my time helping organisations to diversify their audiences, which is what I'll be focusing on today. So on this slide, you can see it says, "Come to my house for dinner," and it also says, "Let's cook and eat together." So this is a metaphor that I often have in my mind when I'm working with organisations, helping them diversify their audiences, because I believe that we need to shift our mindset from my house, come to my house, to let's create this, let's work this new opportunity out together. So in the UK, many studies have shown that the wealthiest, better educated and least ethnically diverse 8% of the population still forms the most culturally active segment of all. But what about the rest of the population? Today, when I'm talking about diversifying your audiences, what I mean is that whole range of audiences that cultural organisations often find it hard to attract and to retain. For example, younger audiences, in the UK, black audiences, Asian audiences, refugee audiences, people with disabilities, and those on low income. So that's who I'm talking about today. So I'm here to talk about breaking down one of the key barriers to gaining those audiences, and that barrier is our own echo chambers. So Wikipedia, you're allowed to laugh, yes. Wikipedia defines an echo chamber as a metaphorical description of a situation in which beliefs are amplified or reinforced by communication and repetition inside a closed system. The term echo chambers is often used to describe conversations on social media in particular, and particularly those fierce conversations where people are defending their perspective. Otherwise known as confirmation bias and closely related to groupthink. In other words, there's nothing new there. So I really like this quote, which I started this talk with. And I'm actually thinking, instead of using the word problem, the quote gets even better if we use the word opportunity. And I think if we use the word opportunity in this context, it's really helpful. Let's see diversifying our audiences as an opportunity, even when it gets difficult and challenging. So I'm going to start by sharing an example that I feel demonstrates perfectly some of the more challenging conversations to be had in this area of work. So it's the uncomfortable art tours, which are run by a woman who calls herself the exhibitionist in the UK. And her uncomfortable art tours focus on how major institutions came into being against a backdrop of imperialism. In her museum and gallery tour, she unravels the role colonialism played in shaping and funding major national collections. She looks at the broader material history of celebrated works, where the money comes from, the ways they've been displayed, and the ideological aesthetics at work. As she says, the history of British art is also the history of empire and genocide, written by collectors who traded in landscapes and lives. And these tours run at major sites such as the National Gallery, the British Museum, and Tate Britain. My understanding is she began them without the permission of these organisations and just invited people to turn up and to hear her alternative narrative. So earlier, I said there are, let's stay with that for a minute. There are a whole range of audiences that cultural organisations often find it hard to attract and retain. And yet, in the UK, there is clear evidence of interest and demand for cultural engagement by those audiences, including the areas of film and video, including cinema attendance, TV viewing, music, including radio, and culture-specific events that reflect a particular heritage that perhaps the mainstream isn't provided. I'll give an example of what I mean by that in a moment. So what I mean by that is there is a demand there that perhaps isn't always recognised, even if it's not showing up in attendance at some of our major venues in the UK. So in my 30 years of working in the arts, I've heard many arguments as to why it is difficult or even impossible to attain a diverse audience. For example, belief number one, certain types of programming is risky. Often in the UK called diverse programming. Belief number two, there's no demand from certain types of audience. Well, I've just talked about that one. And belief number three, our core mainstream audience will be offended by the behaviour of the new audiences that we attract because they're different. So I'll quickly talk through a few examples, just a few examples that challenge those beliefs. So remember I talked about a culture-specific event that reflects and reinforces a particular heritage. So a Mela is a large-scale festival with South Asian roots. And in 2017 in the UK, across six different Melas that were held in the UK, the audiences totalled well over 250,000 people. And 65% of those audiences were Asian or British Asian. So that completely destroys the myth that South Asian audiences aren't interested in going to cultural events, which is, I've heard people say. And interestingly, over a third, 35% of the attenders were not Asian. So that destroys the myth that audiences can't mix. Also interestingly, 54% of those audiences had attended just one arts event over the previous year, which was usually their local Mela. So they're not necessarily what you would call, from a mainstream point of view, a typical audience. So these Mela festivals are not just providing a much-needed art form for this audience, they're also attracting a mixed audience. They're attracting people who are not South Asian. Another quick example, Orchestras Live is an organisation in the UK that schedule relaxed concerts. And these are events where it's okay to make noise or to have people running around. So people who have particular needs related to different types of neurodiversity can be themselves, basically. What's interesting about what Orchestras Live do with their relaxed concerts is that they're not specifically organised for people with disabilities or additional needs, even though they're very suitable for that audience. So they actually get a very mixed, intergenerational audience, from babies in arms, with parents and siblings, to elders from care homes, to children and adults with additional needs. Orchestras Live also produce the Able Orchestra, which is shown here in this image at the BBC Proms. The orchestra is an inclusive ensemble, meaning some of the musicians are disabled and some aren't. And my third quick example is Outspoken. This is a poetry collective, and they put on a monthly poetry, spoken word, and music night with a focus on diverse artists and audiences. Their audience size is typically 100 to 200 people, and it's run by a diverse team. So three of them identify as BAME, which in the UK means Black and Minority Ethnic. So that, they're either Black or they're Asian or they're Polish or Irish. And one identifies as LGBTQ. So it's a very mixed team. And They put on a very diverse programme, and their audience survey showed that they have a 20% audience who identify as white, and the rest identify as BAME. So again, they're attracting a very mixed audience. Interestingly, over a third of their audience have never been to a spoken word gig before. And the rest, and 61% rarely or never read poetry books. So they're attracting a new and diverse audience to what is often one of the hardest art forms to gain a new audience for, which is poetry. So a key question for us is, how can we create spaces and experiences that reflect a diverse range of histories, people, dreams, cultures, and ways of being? How can more of us get those type of results too? Well, firstly, diversifying our audiences requires a new approach. This isn't just my opinion. I have been working on this for many years. I've done many national studies, have mentored people from failure to success in this area. And in my work, I find that many cultural organisations are still stuck in old models, such as the following. They see diversity as an add-on, an extra. It's an add-on to the main or real programme or audience. They are therefore approaching certain types of work as small-scale or temporary, and they're seeing certain audiences as separate and other. I have a promoter friend, Paul, who is very successful in attracting Somali audiences, and he says that many arts organisations approach diversifying their programme and audiences as a source of missionary work, like we're doing good for those people. Before I go on, let's just check, is there a do-nothing option? If I look at the stats for just ethnicity alone in the UK, and bear in mind, I'm talking to you today about a range of audiences. It's just that in the UK, a lot of work has been looked at the BAME audience. In the UK, by 2051, it is predicted that 1 in 5 people will be from an ethnic minority. And I believe there's a similar trend regarding immigrants in Oslo. So, you know, demographics are changing, and they're changing rapidly. The risks that organisations in the UK are waking up to are risking being seen as irrelevant and outdated. And that's already happening for some organisations. It's almost like if you're not thinking globally, you're kind of like really old-fashioned. If you're not thinking in an inclusive way, you're behind the times. You could risk losing your audience to other, more savvy providers and promoters. You could actually lose out on funder income. In the UK, one of our main funders, the Arts Council, is now insisting that you take diversity seriously and that you can prove that you're tackling it. You could miss out on earned income because the statistics alone, and I just gave you the stats for ethnicity, but also if you look at LGBTQ, if you look at disability, if you look at young people, etc., these audiences are significant markets, and diversifying your audience makes economic sense. You could also be missing out on the growth, the learning and the opportunities, the new ideas, the new methods that come from working, in the new thinking that comes with this way of working. And you might even find you could be lobbied or potentially sued for lack of representation. And I'll give you an example around that a little later on. So I would argue there probably isn't a do-nothing option anymore. So back to this question of diversifying audiences. Many studies show a lack of success suggests the impact of an echo chamber. In other words, our default thinking and systems get in the way. And certainly when I'm working with organisations around diversifying the audiences, one of the first things I'm dealing with is the way that they think and the way that they're thinking unconsciously actually about things. Diversifying our audiences requires a new approach. One way to deepen our perspective is to ask new questions, questions that don't come from this echo chamber. And to ask those new questions, we need to invite in new people and hear different perspectives. This process of bringing in new perspectives causes a lot of questions about how we do things around here. So we need to be ready to examine, well, how far do we want to go? How far are we prepared to go? This can bring up even more questions about our own commitment, our own barriers. So here are some degrees, if you like, that I've seen people be prepared to go. And I would ask you to think about your answer as I'm going through these. So the first degree is, well, we want to meet our funder targets. We want to do what we've been asked to do. The next level is, we want to attract new and more audience. We actually genuinely want to do that. The next level is, we want to be a best practice pioneer. We want to do the very best we can do, almost like take the methodology to its limit. The next level is, we actually want to change the arts. We want to change the cultural sector. And then the ultimate level is, we want to transform society. That is what our work is for. I personally think that last option, transforming society, is the most rewarding and the most exciting option we can take. And I think if you stand in that pathway, the results you get can be extraordinary. So let's break it down. So I've talked about becoming aware of our echo chambers, and I've talked about examining our models around diversifying our audiences. It's also really important to dig deep into the audience experience and to start thinking from the audience first, from the audience inwards. This is, of course, good marketing practice, but particularly so when it comes to diversifying audiences, because it helps to disrupt our default mechanisms, those echo chambers. So there are 3 studies that I refer to a lot at the moment, which I think are very helpful in diversification of audiences. And I really like the content of them, not just because I co-wrote 2 of them. So the first one comes from Glasgow Women's Library in Scotland, who are an excellent organisation who've written a great guide on equality, diversity and inclusion. Here are some of the questions they invite us to ask to see things from the audience point of view. And I really recommend you download the document, because there's a richness in that document I can't possibly convey in a short keynote. So is this place, so you could say, is our place, is our organisation, our offer, centred on a default human? Do we already have an expectation about who this is for? Am I represented? Now, this is coming from the audience point of view. Can I see myself represented in this organisation? Does this speak to my experience? Can I connect with it? Is my ability to access this place seen as an adaptation, like that add-on? So it's another way of saying that, I guess, is to say, as an audience member, do I feel welcome? Do I feel thought about here? It's quite simple, really, when you think about it. The second study I refer to is called Open Up. This was a very recent national study which provides a toolkit for audience diversification based on museums that have been highly successful in this area. So the toolkit is built on success. It's built on organisations that have actually had results in this area. Although it's museum-based, the toolkit is actually transferable for our whole sector. You can download it for free. If you just Google Open Up Museums, you'll find this wealth of information. Part of that toolkit is a list of 8 success factors. There isn't time for me to discuss all of them here, so I'm going to share 2 that I feel are key right now. So the first one is simply to have a compelling, people-focused vision. You have to believe that change is possible and desirable. And whenever I say that to people, I just feel like it sounds too simple. It just sounds too everyday. And yet all the studies that I'm aware of and all the work I've done have shown this is key. And all the successful organisations I've talked to, it's the number one thing they say. We had a vision. We really believed. We saw something was possible. The second success factor is to have a 360-degree commitment to equality, diversity, and inclusion throughout the organisation, throughout the whole organisation. This means treating our audiences as a priority. It means recognising and challenging our unconscious bias. It means taking a whole organisation approach, not project-based. And it means having a diverse leadership team. The third study I refer to is called Not for the Likes of You. Again, a national study, and this time for all art forms, providing a toolkit and case studies for those who wish to attract a broader audience. The key message from this study is if you want to diversify your audience, you need to reposition. It's a marketing job. A key aspect of repositioning is to change or develop your message about who you are, where you stand in the marketplace, and who you are there to serve. An extreme analogy would be, imagine if a cigarette company were to move into healthcare. They'd have quite a job to persuade us that their message was believable. Thankfully, what we offer in the arts is an easier sell. But for many people, for those new audiences that we want to bring in, that sense of disconnect based on our old messages, often unconscious messages, is quite strong in their minds. In the UK, for mainstream organisations that are seen as white or as male or as for people without disability or they're middle class or expensive or out of reach, for those organisations to suddenly say, hey, we want you to engage with us now, can occur as perhaps strange or unfamiliar. It's like somebody who, from your point of view, has ignored you or marginalised you or misunderstood your needs for years, and they suddenly invite you to dinner. You might feel excited or maybe relieved, but you might also feel insulted or suspicious or used or uncomfortable. So I'm going to give a few more quick examples of organisations that have challenged the old models, created a vision, given it a 360-degree attention, and/or repositioned themselves. So this is an image from a wonderful open-air museum called Beamish, which is in the northeast, and it's a living museum. So you go there and it's like you step back in time. And everyone's wearing the clothes from the old days. Over half of their staff hail from a category that in the UK we call C2DE. In other words, the working class, the people on lower income, the people who are not in managerial positions. And at Beamish, their staff come from the local audience they wish to attract and serve. So another key success factor, by the way, is to model internally what you wish to attract and represent externally. And also 7% of their staff identify as having a disability. So Beamish has successfully challenged the typical middle-class museum visitor profile, and their visitor numbers have more than doubled in the last 8 years. In the UK, this is extraordinary because a lot of people would argue if you're targeting the lower income bracket, you're not going to be financially successful. And by the way, Beamish doesn't get any funding. They're a commercial enterprise. Here's an interesting example, Colston Hall. I find this one fascinating. This is in Bristol, in the west of England. So Colston Hall is like a music and events venue, and it's named after a slave trader. Mr. Colston was a slave trader many years ago. And because people are now challenging the echo chambers, and especially online, challenging certain ways of thinking, and they have a large BAME community, a large black community, many people were saying to them, we find the name offensive. And actually, the people that were saying they find the name offensive came from all communities, not just the black communities. We don't want this venue because it doesn't represent who we are and what we value. And it kind of came to a head when the band Massive Attack refused to play there because of this name. So they had to start to take action. So first of all, they consulted the community, and there was a split of opinion. So the chief exec had to make the very difficult decision and decided to rename the hall. This is what I mean when I say sometimes the decisions that are made in really being there, really honouring the audience can be quite tough. And they're in that process now of rebranding, repositioning the whole venue. And here's another example. Museum Detox are a group of museum professionals who happen to be BAME, who challenge current models of thinking by setting up clinics at conferences for museums, almost like a doctor's clinic, and they invite their museum peers to take the white privilege test. And they then prescribe a remedy, sort of solutions. And it's very playful, but it has a serious message and an enlightening effect. And there are lots of privilege tests that you can take around being able-bodied or being straight, for example, those kind of things. So, how can we create spaces and experiences that reflect a diverse range of people, histories, cultures, stories, and dreams? Start by deconstructing your echo chamber. If you've got a closed system, open it up. Look at your beliefs. As I said before, a good way to do this is to think from the audience inwards. A lot of people I mentor initially don't realise they have a closed system, and they say, Mel, we've tried everything, we've done this, we've done that, it's not working. But there's one piece they're not aware of or not conscious of. So you could invite your potential audience to show you where they think you are closed and where they think you're perpetuating outdated beliefs, perhaps unconsciously. Will their perceptions of what you're offering match yours? Will this process challenge and change everything? Maybe. It doesn't have to. You might change or develop your program, your board, your marketing, and sometimes you might not need to. The work of diversifying audiences takes us on a journey, which I said is a journey from unconscious bias, which is recognizing how our quick default judgments impact and exclude others. We all have it, by the way. I have made so many mistakes in the area of diversity. I've judged people. I've made assumptions. We all do that. To conscious inclusion, where we're actively seeking to include. To what I would call conscious connection, transforming systems of power and privilege through a deep partnership with those who are different to us. So, in summary, let's review our models regarding diversity. Let's be ready to examine how far we want to go and why do we want to do that. Let's have an authentic vision. Let's think from the audience first. Let's give it a 360-degree commitment where everyone is involved and believes in it. Let's reposition and change our messaging to bring people in. Making dinner together can involve consultation, co-design, and building relationships. So may I invite you to try something delicious. It's what the world is serving us today and every day, diversity. It's full of essential nutrients for everyone, if only we would allow ourselves to taste it fully. And when we truly do make dinner together, it's a feast. Diversity is not a side dish, it's the main course. Enjoy. Tusen tack. And oops, there was another slide. Oh, there it is. If you have questions or you want to challenge anything I've said or explore it, please come to the session that I'm running here with Kath Hume at 11:45. Thank you so much.